Good morning, and we are in section um, 98 to 101 this week. Be still and know that I am God. Uh, we've got this picture depicting the mob violence in Missouri, Jackson County, and we're going to talk about that today. That's pretty much what we're going to be on. So, for the Saints, in the 1830s, Independence, Missouri was literally the Promised Land. It was the centerpiece of Zion, the city of God on earth, and the gathering of the saints there was an exciting prelude to the second coming. But their neighbors in the area saw things differently. They objected to the claim that God had given the land to the saints, and they were uncomfortable with the political, economic, and social consequences of so many unfamiliar people moving in so quickly. Discomfort soon turned to persecution and violence. In 1833, the church's printing office was destroyed, and the saints were forced from their homes. Joseph Smith was more than 800 miles away in Kirtland, and this news took weeks to reach him. But the Lord knew what was happening, and he revealed to his prophet principles of peace and encouragement that would comfort the saints, principles that can also help us when we face persecution, when our righteous desires go unfulfilled, or when we need a reminder that our daily afflictions will eventually, somehow, work together for our good. And that's Doctrine and Covenants 98:3. Therefore he giveth this promise unto you, with an immutable covenant, that they shall be fulfilled, and all things wherewith you have been afflicted shall work together for your good, and to my name's glory, saith the Lord. And I think it did. One of the things I marvel at, that I don't know if it's talked a lot, but I think about what happens when in a few years, well, in the about 30 years, I guess, what happens in that region as war breaks out, as civil war breaks out, and the violence and the things that happened there were really horrendous. And I kind of like to think that the saints escaped having any part of that, um, when instead they would have been embroiled in this um, civil war, and instead they were able to be in the Rocky Mountains where it was much safer. And I think the Lord knew what he was doing, but he was trying to get people to establish, and who knows if they would have been able to establish Zion, built the temple, and had less contentions and things like that among themselves, maybe there would have been less difficulties or less bloodshed and violence later on. We don't know. It wasn't just the saints either. It was the people there that had their own choices to make. Now, we have a lot of reading this week. The scriptures alone will take us into almost 30 um, verses each, which is a lot more than the last few weeks. Um, we've also got down here Sea Saints, um, and you've got about 20 pages there, over 20 pages there. But I'm not going to do the 20 pages of reading in the saints. We're going to go to waiting for the word of the Lord. Um, and it's still quite long, but it gives us some idea. First of all, we're seeing that the first inklings of violence and that starts in July. Um, and this is how we know that the timeline of different things. So, section 97, that's saying that the axe is at the root of the tree. I believe that's in 97. Even now was given at a time when it was literally happening, and Joseph Smith probably wouldn't have known those things. Um, there's no indication that he got any information until after August 6th, I think, and 97 was in August 2nd. So the leaders in July 20th, 1833, leaders of a mob in Jackson County, Missouri, called a meeting with William W. Phelps and other church leaders. The mob leaders had a number of complaints about the saints. They felt threatened by the saints' belief that Jackson County was a promised land that they called Zion. They objected to the large number of people, many of them poor, who had come to their county over the previous 2 years to build up Zion, and because of an article Phelps had recently published in the Evening and Morning Star discussing legal requirements designed to inhibit the immigration of free blacks to Missouri. The mob was afraid that free black church members would soon begin gathering to Zion, disrupting the racial dynamics in their slaveholding state. In a follow-up editorial, Phelps tried to diffuse the tension between the Saints and Jackson County leaders, but nothing he wrote changed their minds about the Saints' intentions. As far as the mob was concerned, the time for explanations was over. They gave Phelps and his fellow church leaders 15 minutes to agree to move the whole Latter-day Saint community out of the next out uh, community away by next spring, or suffer the consequences. Well, first of all, that is illegal, and Phelps probably felt that. Wait, why? Let's read on. Phelps and other church leaders hesitated. Revelation to Joseph Smith had declared Jackson County to be the place for the city of Zion, so why wouldn't they think, well, we have a right to be here? In fact, the Lord is on our side. Revelation had called Phelps to move his family there and set up a print shop and be established as a printer unto the church. The saints had sacrificed a great deal to build Zion, and could they simply leave it without a promise that the saints would leave? The mob began a campaign of violent intimidation. They harassed, wait, sorry, they battered down the doors of Phelps's house and threw the printing press out the second story into the street below, and then destroyed the building. Isn't it interesting that it was around this time that the Lord was saying that here in Kirtland we should establish a printing press as well. Uh, the Phelps family was left to seek shelter that night in an abandoned stable. Other saints also suffered that day. Bishop Edward Partridge and Charles Allen were tarred and feathered, and Sidney Gilbert's store was attacked. 3 days later, Partridge, Phelps, and other church leaders, seeing no alternative, formally agreed that all saints would evacuate the county by April 1834. I don't know that they could have done much else, and it's easy to lay into them and say, look, you brought this on yourself. Um, but it it doesn't excuse the mob for one thing, but also where would we be in all of this? What would we be doing when we talk about them not fulfilling the commandment of building a temple? Uh, would we have done the same? Do we do the same? Do we, when the prophet has mentioned going to the temple is most important thing, one of the most important things to do? Are we making it a priority in our lives? Or are we setting it aside, thinking maybe one day we'll do that? So I can't really say anything about the Saints there. I think the Saints did the best they could, and yes, there was things that were needed repenting of, and the Lord does chastise them, but He also understands these things. Now, they signed that they would formally agree that the Saints should evacuate the county by April 1834. In our present situation, have nothing to write. The ordinarily verbose Phelps wrote to Prophet Joseph Smith in Kirtland, Ohio. A few days later, Phelps wanted to fulfill his calling to build up Zion, but could not see how he could do so under the current conditions. I wait for the Lord, for the word of the Lord, Phelps stated, hoping that Joseph would seek revelatory answers for why the Lord had allowed these things to happen to Zion. If the Lord will yet speak to his children, it may be well to inquire after the matter concerning the destruction of the printing office, he suggested. In the meantime, Phelps tried to see his trial, um, his trials in a positive light. I know from the experience I have had, he assured the saints in Kirtland in a letter, that it is a good thing to have our faith thoroughly tried. Receiving divine guidance, Joseph Smith did not receive detailed news of the events until August 9th, 1833, when Oliver Cowdery and the Missouri Saints emissary arrived in Kirtland after a 2.5 week journey. The 900 miles that separated Independence from Kirtland ensured that written accounts sent through the mail or published in newspapers did not reach Ohio until mid-August. In the meantime, Joseph Smith had received two revelations, Doctrine and Covenants 97 and 98, in early August, that although they did not address the specific difficulties experienced by the church members in Jackson County on July 20th, nevertheless offered words of divine consolation and the guidance that Phelps and other Missouri saints could later use to help them make sense of their experiences and sufferings. Um, Sorry, I lost my place there because I was looked away for a second. On August 2nd, Joseph Smith dictated what the first revelation, now Doctrine and Covenants 97. In it, the Lord commanded the church's school in Jackson County and reiterated the command that an house should be built unto me in the land of Zion. It just seems almost like too little too late at this point, but also it seems that the Lord's saying, I gave you this commandment 2 years ago, and it would have established you there. The revelation stated that if Zion do these things, she shall prosper and spread herself and become very glorious. Let Zion rejoice, for this is Zion, the pure in heart. However, the Lord warned that the vengeance cometh speedily upon the ungodly. Zion would escape these calamities only if she observed to do all things whatsoever I have commanded her. If not, I will visit her according to her works with sore afflictions. Joseph Smith received the second revelation, now Doctrine and Covenants 98, on August 6th. Although the Lord encouraged the saints to support the U.S. Constitution and rule of law, the revelation warned that when the wicked rule, the people mourn. Anticipating coming persecutions, the revelation commanded church members to renounce war and proclaim peace. When they suffered abuse from enemies of the church, the saints were commanded to bear it patiently, forgive other, forgive their oppressors, allow the Lord to avenge the wrong. And we're going to be reading that tomorrow. Um, these revelations were sent in a letter to Missouri on August 6th. Sorry, just keep fiddling around with it. It's going everywhere. These revelations were sent, 3 days before Cowdery's arrival in Kirtland. When received in Jackson County around the beginning of September, the revelations were doubtless a source of comfort and direction for saints such as Phelps, who had been waiting to receive divine guidance. After much tribulation cometh the blessing. Taking counsel from Joseph's revelations, the Missouri church leaders worked to find legal protection from the mob and from its demand that they leave by spring. In September and October 1833, they sought redress from the state officials and hired attorneys to represent the church, uh, represent the Latter-day Saints' cause in courts. The saints' legal actions had convinced the mob that the church members wouldn't leave unless driven out. Before their case could be heard in the court, mob violence broke out again. In late October and early November, Jackson County vigilantes threatened saints and then drove them from their homes. Although church members made some effort to defend themselves, they evidently sought to follow the Lord's counsel in the August 6th revelation to endure their persecutions patiently. On November 6th, while living as a refugee in Clay County, just north of Jackson County, Phelps wrote first detailed account to Joseph Smith of the violence, describing beatings of church members, destruction of their houses, and even bloodshed on both sides. He signed it, "Yours in affliction." Over the next week, as Phelps continued to think about what had happened, a passage from the New Testament came to mind. The Savior said, "Blessed are ye when ye are hated of all men for my name's sake," he wrote in November 14th. And I think that we have come to that. As this letter and other reports of explosions trickled into Kirtland in late November and early December, Joseph Smith prayerfully sought the revelatory guidance that Phelps and other saints desperately desired. In December 10th letter, Joseph reminded the church leaders in Missouri that in 1831 the Lord had previously warned church members that after much tribulation cometh the blessing. Although the Lord had not yet revealed why the great calamity had come upon Zion, or by what means he, the Lord, will return her back to her inheritance, remained sorry. Joseph remained confident that Zion would be redeemed in God's own due time. The prophet advised the saints not to sell their lands in Zion and encouraged them to seek legal redress from the state and federal officials. If the government failed the saints, they would plead to the Lord day and night for divine justice. Joseph concluded with a prayer that God would remember his promises regarding Zion and deliver the saints. December 16th and 17th, Joseph dictated an extended revelation. Now, Doctrine and Covenants 101. That provided answers to questions that he, Phelps, and other saints had been asking. The Lord had allowed the calamity to occur in consequence of the saints' transgressions. Nevertheless, The Lord stated, "Notwithstanding their sins, my bowels are filled with compassion towards them." Although the saints were scattered, Zion would not be moved out of her place. Concerning Zion's redemption, the revelation related a parable of a certain nobleman who had commissioned his servants to protect the vineyard. While the servants disputed among themselves, the enemy came by night and destroyed their works and broke down their olive trees. The Lord commanded his servant to take all the strength of mine house and redeem my vineyard, reiterating the affirmation of the U.S. Constitution from um, Doctrine and Covenants 98. The revelation repeated Joseph Smith's earlier counsel that the Missouri Saints seek redress from civil authorities, with the promise that if government officials rejected church members' pleas, the Lord would come forth out of his hiding place in his fury and vex the nation. Doctrine and Covenants 101 provided the prophet a divinely inspired plan of Zion's redemption, a project that would occupy his attention for the remainder of his life. By early 1834, a copy of the Revelation that would um, become Doctrine and Covenants 101 had arrived in Missouri and provided William W. Phelps the providing I reread that wrong somehow. Had arrived in Missouri, providing William W. Phelps the word of the Lord that he had been waiting for. On February 27th, he wrote to Joseph Smith, updating him on the saints' efforts to receive justice in Missouri in the Missouri court system. As Phelps closed his letter, he alluded to the revelation. Phelps wondered if the servants of the Lord of the vineyard, who are called and chosen to prune it for the last time, would fear to do as much for Jesus as he did for us. No, he answered, we will obey the voice of the Spirit, that good may overcome the world. Quite a heavy lot in that as they receive these beatings and things. And we'll get more into this as we're reading this week. We've got a lot of reading. There's also some videos in here, down here, to watch, which of course I'm going to leave for you guys to watch yourself. But this week, I think we're going to have a lot in here to cover historically and doctrinally. So I hope you have a wonderful day today, and we'll see you tomorrow.